By early 1775, the American colonies were living in a pressure chamber. Every month brought new restrictions, new taxes, and new signs that the crown no longer viewed the colonists as free Englishmen, but as subjects to be commanded. In churches and town halls, the beliefs took hold that their rights were not granted by Parliament, they were granted by God. And if those rights were threatened by force, the people had a duty to stand firm. That conviction spread quietly but powerfully across New England. All of it was leading toward a single moment. The rising tension, the resolve, the moral clarity, it would all collide in two Massachusetts towns named Lexington and Concord. No one knew the exact day, but everyone sensed that when that first confrontation came, it would change everything. And when the crack of that first musket finally tore through the morning air, the world learned that America would fight for their freedom. Welcome to our republic.
When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political band,
sailors and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force.
Well, I think it's time we ask ourselves if we still know the freedoms that were intended for us by the founding fathers. Not one small step for man.
Those three hallowed words reverently dictate what you ought to be, what you can be, what you will be.
We pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor.
General Thomas Gage had orders from London to crush colonial resistance before it grew into a real threat. His mission was simple: seize the gunpowder, confiscate the weapons, and arrest the leaders if possible, and remind the colonists who ruled them. It was a calculated attempt at disarmament, the Crown's effort to stop Americans from having the means to defend their own liberties. Wow, does that mirror what's trying to be done today in our own country? Anyway, back to the show. British regulars stepped out in the early morning, expect to surprise the countryside. But Massachusetts was awake. Paul Revere, William Dawes, Samuel Prescott, and a network of writers spread warning faster than Gage had ever imagined. The message wasn't fear, it was preparation. Militias began assembling, not in panic, but with a calm sense of duty. And it wasn't a mob, it was people readying to defend what they believed God himself had entrusted them. And as the sun rose on Lexington Green, about 70 militiamen formed up on Lexington Green, a group of farmers, fathers, artisans, and tradesmen. They were not soldiers in a European sense, and they wore no standard uniform. Right? They didn't carry weapons, or they carried weapons they owned themselves. They had no illusions about their odds. They understood why they were there. Their captain, John Parker, spoke the words that captured the American spirit better than any political document could. Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have war, let it begin here. And I gotta say this right here. I think I've mentioned it before in earlier episodes. Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. That was a huge, huge thing for the founding fathers, the colonists, right? In order to be able to protect their home, it had to be in defense. Outside of defense, it was outside, outside of their Christian beliefs. If they believed they fired first and they were the aggressor, that they actually believed that the Lord would not go with them into the fight. So that stand your ground, don't fire unless fired upon. I mean, we still have that, right? In our rules of engagement, don't fire unless fired upon. It is a founding understanding for our country. Anyway, let me say it again. Stand your ground, don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have war, let it begin here. Moments later, a shot rang out. No one knew who fired it, but once it echoed, history marched forward with force that no one could stop. The British surged, the militia dispersed, men were killed, the first blood of the revolution had been spilled, and it could never be undone. When the British reached Concord, they found the countryside bracing, not breaking. Militiamen streamed from the surrounding towns, gathered strength by the minute. At North Bridge, smoke rising from the village convinced the Americans that their homes were being burned. That was enough. They advanced in formation, calm, deliberate, and resolved. This time, the Americans fired on command, and the British were stunned that these provincials had stood their ground, and they fell back. Ralph Waldo Emerson later described the moment as the shot heard around the world, and he was right. It was the instant the colonies transformed from subjects into a nation willing to fight for its destiny. The British retreat was nothing short of a disaster. Militiamen familiar with every stone wall, tree line, and bend in the road harassed them the entire way back to Boston. And what the British had dismissed as disorganized countrymen now fought with precision born of purpose, striking from cover, withdrawing, and striking again. By the end of the day, the empire ruled that half of the planet had been bloodied by the farmers who refused to kneel. London would later try to reframe this as a rebellion, but rebellions seek to overthrow. The colonists sought only to defend what was already theirs, right? Rebellions seek to overthrow. Think of that, right? London tried the whole propaganda thing. The colonists sought to defend what was already theirs, their rights, their property, and their freedom. For the colonists, this conflict was never merely political or military. It was deeply spiritual. They believed their rights were not granted by Parliament or by any earthly power, but by God, and therefore they could not be taken by force. Liberty was sacred stewardship, sometimes entrusted to them for the sake of their families and for future generations they would never meet. New England pastors preached that resisting tyranny was not rebellion at all. It was obedience to God's moral order. The sermons that echoed across the colony weren't calls for violence. They were reminders that freedom carries responsibility and that refusal to submit to any authority was part of one's duty to heaven. To the British, the colonists were agitators defying the rightful government. To the colonists, they were standing exactly where Providence wanted them to stand. This conviction that God was on the side of liberty is why they stood firm on Lexington Green, why they advanced at North Bridge, and why they would not back down even when facing the greatest military power on earth. Lexington and Concord revealed a truth that is essential to America's identity. The revolution didn't begin with Congress. It began with the people. Ordinary people who worked the land, built towers, worshiped in small wooden churches. They made the first stand. They proved that liberty survives only when regular citizens are willing to defend it. On April 19th, 1775, they didn't fight for empire, ambition, or ideology. They fought because they believed the freedom was a God-given trust, and they intended to keep it. The British marched out to seize weapons. They marched back, shaken, bloodied, and confronted with a hard reality. America would not be ruled by force. And that spark that had burned quietly for years was now a fire that the rest of the world could see. Really appreciate you coming and taking the time to listen. Remember, history is not boring. It is a story of ordinary Americans who, when tyranny came marching, they chose to stand. I will see you next time.